have a love language. We have a sex language.
We have a sex language, yes. Thank you, Jesus, for sex language. Hallelujah.
So fun.
I want a sex language, Jesus.
Everything seemed picture perfect on the outside. Faith, family, and a powerful ministry. But behind closed doors, cracks were forming. When news of Joni Lamb's unexpected divorce surfaced, it wasn't just a headline, it was a bombshell. How could one of Christian television's most influential women face such a personal storm? What really happened behind the scenes? And why did no one see it coming? This turning point may be the most defining chapter of her life yet. It didn't fall apart overnight. That's the thing most people don't understand. There wasn't one big argument, no dramatic fight, no betrayal that made everything crash. Instead, it was quiet. It was slow. It was little things, so small at first that they barely noticed. A conversation that didn't flow the way it used to. A long pause where laughter used to be. A glance that didn't hold the same warmth. Joni and Doug were still showing up for things together, still smiling in public, still doing what they had to do. But behind the scenes, something was shifting, not loudly, but gently, like a tide pulling away from the shore. They weren't angry, they weren't cruel. In fact, they were still trying, still hoping it would get better. But deep down, they both started to feel it, the slow drift happening between them. At first, they thought maybe it was just stress, busy schedules, too much work, not enough rest. They told themselves it was just a phase, that they'd reconnect once things calmed down. But things never really did. Life kept moving fast, and the gap between them kept getting wider, not in big ways, just small, everyday moments. Moments when one of them needed comfort, and the other didn't know how to give it. Moments when silence felt safer than trying to explain what was going on inside. They weren't fighting, and maybe that's what made it harder. There was nothing obvious to fix, no big blow-up to recover from, just quiet misunderstandings, missed chances, words they meant to say but never did. They loved each other, but loving someone doesn't always mean you know how to stay close to them. And so, day by day, they drifted. No one else could see it, not really. To the outside world, everything looked fine. But inside their home, inside their hearts, the distance had already taken root. It wasn't anyone's fault. It just happened, slowly, quietly, until one day, the space between them felt too big to ignore. When Joni and Doug got married, it wasn't just a wedding. It was a headline. People celebrated it like a fairy tale. Two respected leaders, both with strong ministries, finding love again. It gave people hope. It made for a great story. But what nobody really talks about is what happens when your love story becomes everyone else's inspiration. When the world sees your marriage as some kind of symbol, it stops being just about you and the person you're with. And that's where the pressure starts. Joni had lived under a spotlight for decades. Christian TV, millions of viewers, a powerful ministry. She knew what it meant to be watched, judged, admired, and expected to be strong, even when she was breaking inside. After losing her first husband, Marcus, she had held everything together for the sake of her family, her staff, her viewers. When she married Doug, people expected her to do the same. Be strong, be faithful, be the perfect picture of redemption and healing. Doug, on the other hand, came from a different world. He was respected in his own field, yes. A counselor, a speaker, a man people came to for wisdom. But stepping into Joni's world was like jumping into the deep end without a life jacket. Suddenly, he wasn't just Doug, he was Joni Lamb's husband. A public figure overnight. Everything he said, did, or didn't do was noticed. Every moment was up for discussion. Every silence was interpreted. He'd been in ministry, but not like this. Not with cameras, fans, and constant attention. At first, they tried to handle it. They smiled for the cameras, gave interviews, spoke at events together. They leaned into the image because that's what people needed to see. Unity, strength, faith. But the truth was, putting on that image every day was exhausting. It left little room for honesty. It left little space for weakness. There were moments when Joni was completely overwhelmed, but she couldn't show it. Not publicly.
About the sexual text, what he would do to you, and I don't want to say that.
We talked about
I
sex.
don't tell people. I don't tell people what
we talked
you read
about
out to me,
sex,
and
like
see,
two
and I
adults
won't
would.
know.
But he never sexted me. He never said anything inappropriate. We didn't have sex until we got
can I
married.
finish?
He is known for his integrity.
This is just sexual talk.
When Joni had told me those things, again shutting
Told
them
you
down
what things?
about the text he was sending you, and you were happy, and I didn't know how to process it.
What text?
About the sexual text, what he would do to you, and I don't want to say that.
Well, Tex, we talked about sex.
I don't tell people what
we talked
you read out
about
to me,
sex,
and
like
see,
two
and I
adults
won't
would.
know.
But he never sexted me. He never said anything inappropriate. We didn't have sex until we got
can I
married.
finish?
He is known for his integrity.
This is just sexual talk.
Okay, that's
is what
not
she's
even
talking
it.
about.
This is not even it, okay? So when she starts telling me about that, I'm keeping it to myself. I'm really starting to get stressed. Things are not sitting well. My body's starting to get really acting up. That's when my panic attacks started happening.
Because I was saying that when you got the text.
When she was reading all this stuff to me. And Rachel and Beck on the other side were, like, what's going on? I'm not telling them not one word about that. Not about that. When Jimmy comes in the picture as the one she trusted, after that, before we all 6 met with Jimmy Evans, I called Jimmy privately because I didn't want to dishonor her or talk about that in front of her other children. I called Jimmy privately the day before the meeting, and he will attest to this. And I said, hey, this is something I don't know how to process. Can you help me process it? Is this okay?
There were times Doug was deeply confused or hurting, but didn't know how to say it. Because how do you open up when the world is watching and expecting you to have all the answers? In private, the pressure showed up in subtle ways. They had to think twice before speaking to each other at events. They had to make sure their tone sounded loving, even if they were tired or distracted. If they stood too far apart, someone would notice. If they didn't mention each other in a broadcast, someone would ask questions. That kind of pressure changes the way you interact. It turns small decisions into performance. It makes real connection harder and harder. They both felt it, but differently. For Joni, it was familiar. She had lived in it for years, but even she wasn't immune to the toll it took. She carried the weight of her ministry, her family, and now her marriage, all under the public's microscope. Every time she tried to protect her private life, someone demanded access to it. Every time she tried to hold things together, it cost her a piece of herself. For Doug, it was like being on trial without knowing the charges. If he spoke too little, he was distant. If he said the wrong thing, he was judged. If he tried to lead, people said he was stepping on Joni's legacy. If he stayed quiet, they said he wasn't involved enough. He couldn't win no matter what he did. And over time, that wore him down. He started second-guessing himself, questioning his place, wondering if he was ever truly accepted in the world he had stepped into. Together, they tried to keep things afloat. They had private talks, prayed together, tried to create space where they could just be themselves. But even in those quiet moments, the weight of public expectation sat in the room with them. It was hard to separate their marriage from their ministry. Hard to tell where real life ended and performance began. They weren't pretending in a dishonest way. They really did care, really did want to make it work. But when you're constantly watched, you start to lose your grip on what's real and what's being performed for the audience. The lines blur. And when you're under that kind of spotlight, there's no room for raw emotions, no space for the messiness that every real relationship goes through. And that's the problem. Relationships need room to be messy. They need privacy. They need time. And Joni and Doug didn't have that. And then came the whispers. People online asking why they looked distant, why Doug wasn't around as much, why Joni seemed quieter than usual. With no explanation, the public filled in the blanks themselves. Rumors started, speculation grew, and suddenly, their private struggles were front-page gossip. People who didn't know them at all felt entitled to an opinion. Every photo, every quote, every silence was picked apart. The truth is, public pressure doesn't just push you to perform. It isolates you. You stop being a person and start becoming a symbol. And when your marriage is a symbol, you don't feel safe enough to talk about what's actually going wrong. You feel like you have to protect the image at all costs, even if it's slowly breaking you inside. That's what happened to Joni and Doug. They were trying so hard to be strong for everyone else that they didn't always feel strong with each other. Wow, when the announcement of their divorce finally came, it was like a thunderclap. People were shocked, confused, disappointed. But for Joni and Doug, it wasn't sudden at all. It was the final chapter in a long story of trying to hold everything together under the weight of unrealistic expectations. A story where love was real, but pressure was louder, where the image mattered more than the reality, until it couldn't anymore. And maybe that's the saddest part, that in trying to be strong for everyone else, they never got the space to be vulnerable with each other. They didn't fail because they stopped loving. They drifted apart because the spotlight never gave them a chance to truly connect, to breathe, to grow together in peace. Their story isn't one of scandal, it's one of being human in a world that sometimes forgets that even leaders, even role models, even the people we admire are just people trying their best under impossible pressure. From the outside, Joni and Doug looked like they had it all figured out. Strong faith, shared goals, and a deep respect for each other. But what people didn't see were the expectations they both carried into the marriage. Expectations that were never clearly said out loud. Expectations that sat quietly between them, shaping how they saw each other, how they reacted, and how they misunderstood. Joni had built a life full of structure. After her first husband, Marcus, passed away, she had no choice but to lead. She had to be strong for her children, her staff, and the entire ministry. Over the years, she developed routines, systems, a way of doing things that worked. It helped her survive. It helped her protect the legacy she and Marcus had spent decades building. So, when Doug came into her life, she wasn't just inviting in a partner. She was bringing him into something sacred, something she had spent years holding together with her own two hands. She expected, maybe without realizing it, that Doug would understand that he would see how carefully her world was built, and that he would honor the space she had created. She didn't say it, not directly, but she hoped he would just know. And Doug, well, he had expectations too. Doug had led his own ministry for years. He was used to being in charge, making decisions, helping people navigate hard things. When he joined Joni's life, he didn't want to just be a guest in her world. He wanted to build something new together. He expected to be a real partner, to be involved, to have a voice, to contribute in a meaningful way. He wasn't trying to take over. He just didn't want to be on the sidelines. But he didn't say that out loud either. He hoped she would see it. He hoped she would invite him in deeper. And that's where the tension began. Not in what was said, but in what wasn't. What Doug saw as helpful suggestions, Joni sometimes felt as pressure. What Joni saw as caution or protection, Doug sometimes heard as rejection. And since neither of them wanted to hurt the other, they kept quiet about their feelings. But that silence didn't make things better. It made everything heavier. It became hard to tell where love ended and frustration began. There were moments when Joni would make a decision about the ministry without asking Doug's input. She didn't mean to leave him out. She was just doing what she'd always done, moving fast, keeping things running. But to Doug, it felt like she didn't trust him, like his opinion didn't matter. He didn't always say anything. Sometimes he just pulled back a little, stayed quiet, waited for an invitation that didn't come. And there were times when Doug would try to step into a leadership role, sharing ideas or making plans, and Joni would freeze. It wasn't that she didn't respect him, she just felt unsure, afraid that if things changed too fast, the structure she had fought so hard to build might fall apart. She didn't always explain that. Sometimes she just got quiet, or changed the subject, and Doug would feel shut out. They both meant well. They both wanted the marriage to work. But good intentions don't always protect you from emotional distance, and without real conversations, the space between them started to grow, not because they didn't care, but because they were each living in their own heads, carrying quiet fears and unspoken needs. Joni needed reassurance that bringing someone new into her life wouldn't cost her the foundation she had fought for. Doug needed inclusion, to know that he wasn't just an outsider in someone else's story. But neither of them knew how to say that without sounding needy or ungrateful or weak. So they both stayed strong on the outside and alone on the inside. Over time, that isolation became normal. They'd have dinner together, go to events, appear on camera, and still feel like strangers some days. Not all the time. There were still moments of closeness, of laughter, of prayer. But those moments started to feel fewer and farther between, because the things they weren't saying were piling up. And the more they tried to keep the peace, the harder it became to actually connect. Doug sometimes felt like he was walking on eggshells, unsure if speaking up would start a fight or just get ignored. Joni felt torn, trying to protect her world while also trying not to make Doug feel excluded. But the more they tried to protect each other's feelings, the more isolated they both became. It wasn't that they didn't talk, it's that they didn't always talk about the real things, the deep fears, the quiet disappointments, the unmet hopes. They smiled, they prayed, they pushed forward, but under the surface, they were drifting. Two people standing in the same room, but feeling miles apart. And then came the small misreadings. Doug would say something with good intentions, and Joni would take it the wrong way. Joni would get quiet, And Doug would assume she was angry when she was just overwhelmed. They weren't fighting. They were guessing what the other person was thinking, guessing what they needed, and getting it wrong. That kind of emotional disconnection doesn't show up in big explosions. It shows up in sighs, in silence, in the moments where you want to reach out, but something holds you back. And those moments add up. They add up until one day, it's not just emotional distance, it's emotional exhaustion. And when you're tired like that, it gets even harder to have the conversations you need. You're afraid of making things worse. You're afraid of hearing something you're not ready to hear. So you just keep going, keep doing what you've always done. Until one day you realize you've been holding hands with someone who feels like a stranger, and neither of you knows how it got to this point. That's what happened with Joni and Doug. They loved each other, yes, but love wasn't the problem. The problem was the silence, the expectations that never got named, the emotions that never got unpacked, the hope that the other person would just know what you need, and the disappointment when they don't. They were both leaders, both strong, both used to helping other people through pain. But when it came to their own, they got stuck, not because they were weak, but because they didn't want to break each other's hearts. And in trying to protect one another, they ended up feeling more alone than ever. The day the divorce became public, it felt like the air got knocked out of the room. For their followers, supporters, and the people who had rooted for them, it was a shock. Joni and Doug had always looked like they were solid, not perfect, but steady. They were leaders, people of faith, a couple who had been through life's hardest moments and found each other on the other side. To many, their marriage symbolized redemption, a second chance at love after loss. So when the announcement came, it didn't feel like just news. It felt like something broke, something sacred. But for Joni and Doug, that moment, the day the world found out, wasn't the real breaking point. It was the ending of something that had been unraveling quietly for a long, long time. And here's the thing, no one tells you. Divorce doesn't always come with shouting matches or slammed doors. Sometimes it comes with silence, with worn-out hearts, with two people who are just too tired to try anymore. It's not about giving up, it's about realizing that holding on is costing more than it's giving. That's where Joni and Doug were. They had tried hard. They had prayed together, cried together, had long conversations, short ones, and moments of hope where it felt like maybe they'd find their rhythm again. But no matter how many times they came back to the table, something between them stayed stuck. There were wounds that couldn't heal with time alone. There were misunderstandings that kept circling back around, and at some point, love stopped being enough to hold the weight of everything else they were carrying. The decision to end a marriage isn't easy, especially when your marriage is public, especially when people are watching, forming opinions, and attaching meaning to your every move. Joni didn't just lose a relationship, she lost a chapter of her story she'd hoped would last. She had believed in this marriage. She had walked into it with open arms, trying to embrace a future that honored her past, but didn't stay trapped in it. She wanted to show the world that healing is possible, that after grief, there can be joy again. And for a while, there was. But just because something starts in love and faith doesn't mean it will last forever. Sometimes two people are simply walking different paths. And no matter how hard they try to walk them side by side, those paths keep pulling them in opposite directions. Doug felt it too. The confusion, the disappointment, the weight of trying to lead others while feeling lost in his own home. He had been a counselor for years, someone who helped others navigate pain and find clarity. So when his own marriage started to crack, he didn't know where to go with all that shame and self-doubt. How could he not fix this? How could the very thing he spent his life teaching suddenly feel impossible? He didn't take the decision lightly. Neither of them did. But at some point, staying in the marriage started to feel less like a partnership and more like a performance. One where both people were trying not to fall apart in front of the world. That's not what marriage is supposed to be. It's not supposed to be a place where you feel alone. It's not supposed to feel like a job where failure isn't allowed. It's supposed to be where you can take off the mask. And neither of them had felt that for a while. So, they let go. And letting go, as painful as it was, wasn't defeat. It wasn't failure. It was acceptance. It was honesty. It was two people saying, "We've come as far as we can go together." It was a turning point. A way to finally stop pretending things were okay when they weren't. A way to start healing. separately, after trying for so long to heal as one. Of course, the outside world didn't see it that way. People had questions. People had opinions. Some were kind, understanding that life is complicated. Others were harsh, pointing fingers, demanding explanations. But Joni and Doug knew the truth. They had tried, they had loved, they had hoped, and sometimes that still isn't enough. After the announcement, Joni carried herself with grace. That's who she is. Even when she was heartbroken, she showed up with strength. She kept her focus on her ministry, her family, her faith. She spoke carefully, not because she was hiding something, but because she respected the story she and Doug had lived. She wasn't there to throw blame. She wasn't there to build walls. She just needed space to grieve without being torn apart by public opinion. Behind the cameras, though, it wasn't easy. Every smile cost her something. Every kind word came with a heavy heart. She was tired, not just physically, but emotionally, spiritually. She had lived through loss before, but this was different. This was the end of something she had chosen, fought for, and believed in, and now it was gone. Doug had his own road to walk. His identity had been wrapped up in helping others, and now he had to face his own pain under a spotlight he never fully asked for. People questioned him, wondered if he had been honest, wondered what had really happened. And that kind of public pressure makes it hard to heal. It makes it hard to breathe. But in the quiet, something else began. Something softer, something that didn't have to perform for the world. Joni started finding herself again, not as a wife or a widow or a public figure, but as a woman who had weathered more than most and was still standing. She found peace in small things, moments with family, quiet mornings, honest prayers that didn't need to sound perfect. Doug, too, started to rebuild, away from the noise. He began looking at what came next, not with bitterness, but with humility. He knew mistakes had been made by both of them, but he also knew that growth sometimes comes through the most painful endings. He had to face his own heart and ask hard questions, not to punish himself, but to understand himself better. Their divorce wasn't just an ending, it was a door. One they didn't expect to walk through, but one that might eventually lead to more honest, more peaceful, more authentic lives. That's the thing about turning points. They usually come wrapped in pain. But once you get through the heartbreak, they can lead to something beautiful. Joni and Doug didn't stop being people of faith. They didn't stop caring. They didn't stop serving others. But they had to learn to do it in a new way, one that made space for their own humanity, their own needs, their own healing. And maybe that's what this part of the story is really about. Not failure, not shame, but transformation. Divorce didn't define them. It refined them. It reminded them that sometimes love means letting go, not because you don't care, but because you finally do. They'll always carry the story they shared, the lessons, the memories, the good times, and the hard ones. But now they're each learning how to move forward, separately, but still with purpose, still with hope, still with faith. And maybe that's the quiet victory no one saw coming. Not that they stayed together no matter what, but that they chose peace over pretending. Honesty over image, growth over fear. That's not a defeat. That's the start of something new.